The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a free and open platform for theater makers worldwide. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Lear. Many of William Shakespeare's plays pose problems for those of us who want to stage them in the 21st century. People in Shakespeare's era thought very differently about matters such as sex and gender. However, some artists and scholars, such as today's guest, are embracing the difficult aspects of Shakespeare's plays, using them as the basis for explorations of contemporary issues. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Nora Williams. She holds a PhD in drama from the University of Exeter, and she's the creator of Measure Still for Measure, a practice as research project that involves reimagining Measure for Measure as a way of instigating discussions about matters such as rape, sexual assault, and consent. Nora, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. I'm thrilled to be here.
For those of us who maybe haven't read the play in a while, can you refresh our memories about Measure for Measure? And maybe also explain what it is about this play that speaks to our present moment?
Sure. Measure for Measure is one of those plays that isn't taught in schools very often and isn't performed very often, partly because it's considered a problem play. So traditionally in Shakespeare scholarship, that means that it doesn't fit neatly into a genre category. It's not really a comedy. It's not really a tragedy. We can't kind of pin down exactly what it is. So we hear people talk about Shakespeare's plays all the time, saying that they're still relevant today, and people say that like it's a good thing. And I think with Measure for Measure and other plays we can name, Othello comes to mind right away. It's not necessarily a good thing that they're still relevant. There are issues in these plays that we really should have resolved sometime in the last 400 years that we haven't figured out yet. In Measure for Measure, that issue, I think, is about power and toxic masculinity and female bodily autonomy and women's right to choose in any number of ways, and issues around sex and gender and consent, very clear, particularly in the scenes between Isabella and Angelo. So the plot of the play, or the main plot of the play, is that Claudio is engaged to a woman named Juliet. They're not married yet. Juliet becomes pregnant, as happens, and at the same time, the Duke of Vienna, where they all live, abdicates his position. He decides he's going to kind of take a break. And in his place, he appoints a deputy named Angelo, who starts enforcing a lot of laws that have been on the books for a long time, but weren't being enforced. And among them is a law against fornication, which is any sex outside of marriage. So Claudio is one of the first people to be arrested under this new enforcement, and he is put in prison and sentenced to basically immediate execution. He's going to die as a result of getting his fiancée pregnant. So Claudio's friend goes to Claudio's sister, Isabella, who is about to take her vows as a nun, and says to her, we've tried everything else. We need you to go and plead your brother's case before Angelo, the deputy. So she goes and she pleads his case, and she says sort of, I don't think this is good. I'm about to be a nun. But you have to take account of difference, and you have to put yourself in Claudio's shoes. You must have sinned in your life. You must have felt what he is feeling. And if you can't, kind of don't throw stones at a glass house, whatever that proverb is. And she essentially runs rhetorical circles around him. It's a fabulous scene where she really has the upper hand. And she leaves that scene with Angelo saying, well, I'll think about it. Come back tomorrow. And when she comes back, Angelo says to her, look, here's the deal. If you have sex with me, I'll let your brother go. Cool. Her reaction is pretty much what you'd guess. She's like, A, I'm a nun. No. B, you. No. C, hypocrite much. And they have a lot of back and forth. And eventually Angela says to her, look, the thing is, either you have sex with me, or not only will I execute your brother, I will also torture him first. So pretty clear consent issue here, not just the power differential, but also obviously a coercive element there. And the play sort of continues to unfold with everybody sort of trying to figure out how to get out of this. Claudio's trying to figure out how to not die, and he actually says to his sister, well, maybe you should just do this for me, because I'm gonna die, and what's your immortal soul in the face of death, which she obviously is not convinced by, being a nun. And the Duke, meanwhile, has disguised himself as a friar and gets himself involved, and there's all kinds of complicated back and forth with a bed trick and a head trick, and at the end of the play, Claudio does not die. The Duke reveals himself to not actually be a friar and promptly proposes marriage to Isabella, who does not respond, does not get a line in response. So I think it's clear, particularly in sort of the Weinstein moment that we're living in right now, how this play is relevant. But I think it's also important to say that it has been relevant for all of the same reasons around consent and sexual assault for a long time. And I've been working on this project for about 3 years. And when I started, it was Emma Sulkowicz at Columbia who was in the news carrying her mattress. And at every point that I've been working on it in the last 3 years, there's been a name that immediately comes to mind, or a case that immediately comes to mind that people are thinking of when we work on it.
Yeah, and I'm struck by your saying that, yes, it's still relevant, but for all the wrong reasons. Relevant isn't a good thing in this case. And I'm curious about how your project kind of relates to the cult of Shakespeare and what you gain from adapting the original play in this way.
It's a question that I get a lot about this project. If you want to talk about contemporary women, if you want to work on something that speaks to the contemporary moment, why use Shakespeare? Why not come up with a new play? Why not just dive into some straight devising? Because there's a strong devising component to this project. And my answer usually is that Shakespeare is such a cult figure, as you say, has such cultural capital, has such a hold over still 21st century culture in so many ways, that actually taking Shakespeare kind of down a peg by adapting Shakespeare and by saying, okay, well, this is how you told this story 400 years ago, but this is not how we would tell the same story in the present. That has a kind of disruptive power. And so we can sort of capitalize on the power that Shakespeare has culturally in order to get people in the door. And then also manipulate Shakespeare a little bit and sort of show people that, like, look, Shakespeare can only tell us one side of a story, can only tell us one version of a story. And if we actually take the same story, and in most cases with this project, even the exact same words, and change the perspective on them, I think we get at something really powerful in terms of disrupting a narrative, disrupting a patriarchal, hegemonic way of thinking about the world.
And without getting too deep into the weeds of textual analysis here, it's my understanding that calling Measure for Measure Shakespeare's play maybe isn't even entirely accurate?
Yeah, there's a fairly strong scholarly consensus at this point. I would say that Thomas Middleton, who's another playwright from the same period, had some kind of hand in probably editing Measure for Measure after Shakespeare's death. So certainly the version that we have in the folio has a couple of passages that particularly John Jowett and Gary Taylor have argued convincingly are not by Shakespeare and are most likely by Thomas Middleton.
Okay, so this play has been, in a sense, kind of rewritten since the beginning. Now, I'm curious about what you're doing with it today. When and where did this project start? And how did it initially develop?
The project started totally by accident. I was on a research trip in Austin, Texas, and I was at home at my apartment after spending the day in the library watching a live stream of Cheek by Jowl's Russian language production of Measure for Measure. This would have been in 2015. And it was, as I said, in Russian, but with English surtitles. And in another window on my laptop, I had open an article about Emma Sulkowicz, who I mentioned earlier. You probably remember her mostly for the very iconic images of her carrying her mattress around Columbia University. And I was reading about Emma's experience and watching Measure for Measure, and we got to the scene where Angela presents this ultimatum to Isabella. And she has a line in that scene that really slapped me across the face in that moment, watching it and reading about Emma at the same time. She says, "To whom should I complain? Did I tell this? Who would believe me?" And it was like a physical reaction, like a gut punch, slap in the face kind of moment of like, oh, her language is so close to Emma Sulkowicz's language. I felt very, very strongly in that moment that these two women would have something to say to each other, and felt very powerfully the real injustice of not having changed anything much in 400 years, that these two women, centuries apart, could sound so similar, could have exactly the same question in mind. And it bugged me enough that I kept thinking about it. And one of my good friends said to me after I had been ranting about it to her, she was like, "Well, make some theater about this." I said, "Oh, yeah, I could do that." Yeah, that'll work. So when I got back to Exeter, where I was still a PhD student at the time, I gathered up a bunch of my friends who were, professional or kind of semi-professional actors in the area, and we booked out a studio and just started experimenting.
This began in Exeter, but you brought Measure, Still for Measure, all the way from the UK to the Nichols School in Buffalo, New York. Can you tell us about how the project evolved and what that experience in Buffalo was like?
Sure. So I'm a graduate of Nichols School in Buffalo. I'm an alum, and I've remained very close with the theater teacher there, Kristen Tripp Kelly. She's phenomenal. I mean, she's still one of the people whose opinion I trust the most and who I really count as a friend and a mentor. And so it would have been Christmas 2015, I guess. I was in Buffalo visiting for the holidays, and we went out for coffee together, and I told her about this thing that I'd been working on and was like, I don't even know if it's any good. I don't know where it's going. But at that point, we'd been offered a little bit of funding to do a rehearsal and research and development week at the Bike Shed Theater in Exeter with the kind of ragtag group of actors that I'd gathered there. And she was really excited by the project, and we had been looking for an opportunity to collaborate for a long time. And so she sort of said, well, what do you think if we bring it to Nichols, if we do it with she has an advanced acting class that's all high school seniors, and they do usually some kind of devised piece in the second half of the year. So she said, what do you think? If it goes well, if you get what you want out of it and you think it would work, why don't we talk about doing this with my seniors next year? So that's how that got started. And the research and development week did go really well. We kind of got where we wanted to be with that. And Kristen and I sort of agreed that I would work with my team to try and send her a draft script by September of 2016 to start working with her students in the new academic year.
Now, I understand that this is really an international project now. Started in the UK, came to Buffalo, and I understand recently you also brought it up to Canada.
Yeah. I went up to Dalhousie University in Halifax at the invitation of Professor Dave Nichol, who I understand has also been on the podcast, to do some Measure for Measure work with his dramaturgy students. And the way that the funding worked out for me to go there, we ended up opening the workshop to the public. So we had members of the Villains Theatre, which is a group that does Renaissance drama that isn't by Shakespeare, basically, in Halifax. So that was really cool to have a mix of students and professional actors in the room. I feel like it was a really good, productive week.
Now, with each of these workshops, I'm curious about what kind of the creative process is like. What is everyone getting together to do? How are you working with the text and turning it into something different?
So it's a little bit different every time. And that's kind of the point, is that whatever group of people we have in the room, I really wanted the project to always reflect the people who were working on it. So not to be something that was really static and rigid, but to be flexible enough to reflect the priorities of the room. As I said, every time I've worked on it, there's been a different scandal, a different name, a different case that has been on people's minds. Certainly last year when we were at Nichols, we started rehearsals about 2 weeks before Trump's inauguration. So there was a lot happening that was very much at the front of people's minds as we worked to do with that. But basically, the goal is to adjust Shakespeare and Middleton's play so that Isabella is at the center of it. If my memory of Measure for Measure prior to starting this project was that Isabella was kind of the protagonist, going back to it and working on it and doing the really in-depth dramaturgical work, I realized that, oh, no, she's not. I think you can make an argument for it, but the Duke really sits at the center of the play and is very much the puppet master of the play, in my opinion. And so we start by centering Isabella. So one of the first things that we always do is cut all of the scenes that she's not in, right? They're just out. And all of the other scenes, all the scenes that she is in, the scenes that we keep, the team, whoever's in the room, works to kind of collaboratively cut those internally so that they reflect the kind of story we want to tell. So we made Claudio into Claudia in Exeter, for example, because we felt that having an LGBTQ character would kind of change the story a little bit and reflect the priorities of that group a little bit better. So rather than having a pregnant fiance, it was more that this same-sex couple was being persecuted in Vienna. When I took it to Nichols, the students there felt that the issues that they wanted to deal with were better addressed by having a male Claudio. And it worked out better in terms of the gender balance we had in that room as well. So it really does change depending on who's there. But the thing that stays the same is that the group works collaboratively on the dramaturgy. Once we have a kind of a dramaturgical structure that we're happy with, it really moves into a very physical exploration. So we use viewpoints, we use contact improv, we sometimes use a little bit of Laban, we sometimes use a little bit of yoga or dance or whatever expertise is in the room we take advantage of. And it almost becomes a devising process. It becomes, all right, here's our script, here's our dramaturgy, but we're not tied to that. We can treat the words, and particularly Shakespeare's words, as inspiration, as ingredients, as something we can draw on, as opposed to the thing that's defining our process. So it's a starting point rather than kind of the frame, if that makes sense. So we work collaboratively on essentially choreography, devising and experimenting and seeing what works. And in Exeter, we didn't include any other text besides text from Shakespeare and Middleton's play. In Buffalo at Nichols, I really wanted to see what the students would bring to the room in terms of contemporary texts. So when I presented them with kind of their draft script, their sort of starting point in September, I had included a couple of pieces of contemporary texts that I thought might be relevant, including the letter read out at the Stanford rape trial in 2016, which was very fresh at the time. And they brought in some really creative and exciting texts as well. A lot of music. We had Beyonce's Lemonade. We had music by FKA Twigs. We had Pat Benatar. So we had a lot of fun thinking about, who in the present is kind of speaking to these same issues.
What have you discovered from doing this project, and what does that tell you about how performance and research can go hand in hand?
I started the project not thinking that it would become a research project. I started it really just from this sense of I want to do something about this. I want to get out there and have these conversations and do this work. And the more that I got into the studio and the more that I started working with the play, the more I felt like actually this is research. The practice is the research. It's a practice as research project, as we said. And so I think what I've learned about it is that, first of all, we shouldn't be so afraid to adapt these plays and to teach them to students in order to pick up these difficult issues. I think a lot of the times people who are setting a syllabus of Shakespeare plays will avoid Measure for Measure because it's difficult. It is difficult. It's a very difficult play. It's difficult dramaturgically. It's difficult to talk about these really thorny issues that are in it. It's a hard play to teach, but it's also a wonderful play to teach because you have so many opportunities to open up conversations. And I think theater is a great way to do that. It's a great way to get students talking. One of the Nichols students that participated in the project, Lizzie, gave a fabulous paper at a student Shakespeare conference talking about her experience of the project and really providing, she wouldn't necessarily have called it this, but it was a close reading of Measure for Measure, which she had done totally by accident, just by being involved in the process. And the comments from some of the teachers in the room were, oh, wow, you really understand Measure for Measure. And of course she did, because she'd gotten, kind of elbow deep in it, dealing with all these issues, talking about the really sticky stuff and making choices like, should we have a male or female Claudio? Should we cut this scene or this line or this action? The students at Nichols really felt very strongly that there shouldn't be a bed trick. They felt like that was not in keeping with the message that they wanted to send. They felt that Angelo's own autonomy and his own ability to consent was very problematic in that. And so they cut the bed trick. And then you could almost see it in the room the moment that they all realized that meant either Isabella did actually have to have sex with Angelo or Claudio actually had to die. And then they fought about it and they talked about it and they worked it through and they said, well, if we cut this, what do we have to do about that? And what happens to this scene and what happens to this moment? And they're doing close reading work and they're really understanding, even on a theater history level or a straight up history level, the difference between the politics of the 16th, 17th century and the politics of the present, right? They sort of have to go, okay, so at the time it might have been this, but now if we're going to be 21st century people doing this, here's how we want to think about it. So it becomes almost an accidental academic exercise. And I think that is really powerful and again, really disruptive and in a good way, in the best possible way.
What's next with the project? Do you have additional plans for this? Are you going to move on to something else?
That's a really good question. Right now, actually just this week, I finished up an article, the first kind of scholarly output for the project, which is going to be in Partake, the Journal of Practices Research, this spring. And we are always constantly updating the project website. So that's measurestill.wordpress.com. That is kind of our archive. It's sort of our repository of everything we've done. There's photos, there's videos, there's our program from the Nichols performance, there are versions of the scripts up there, and updating that, I'm a little behind on updating that, so that's kind of the next step. But I'm always on the lookout for kind of the next opportunity for this project because, as I said, unfortunately, it continues to be relevant, and perhaps even more so now than it was 3 years ago when I started. So there's no kind of immediate plan, but if you're listening and you would like a theater workshop with Measure for Measure where you are, let me know.
We will post a link to the website that Nora just mentioned, and you can learn more about the Measure Still for Measure project there. Nora, thank you so much for introducing us to your fascinating project.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes. And you can email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.